Everyone in the old age home underestimated me. They whispered, laughed, and assumed I was truly weak. Little did they know I'd been watching, planning, waiting, and when the time finally came, no one would ever dare cross me again. You want the truth? The truth is that being underestimated is a kind of power. It lets people drop their guard, get careless, reveal themselves in ways they never would if they thought you were a threat. So, I let them think I was harmless. I smiled, I nodded, I shuffled through the halls like someone who'd retired from the world. I learned the rhythm of the place, the way the nurses swapped inside jokes when they thought no one could hear, how the volunteers arrived early on Tuesdays and left by noon, how certain residents held court with cruel little barbs that landed as jokes because everyone agreed in advance that the world had already softened them. They had no idea how sharp my memory still was. They had no idea the ledger I kept, not on paper, but in my head, a precise accounting of slights, omissions, indignities. My son hadn't called my birthday. My daughter had refused to help with a hearing aid and laughed about how expensive aging can get. An aide had told a joke about my dementia as she tucked away my favorite cardigan. What do you do when the people you once protected treat you as if you are disposable? Some people rage. Some people crumble. I learned to wait. I remember the first month like a wound you touch because you can't help it. Bright fluorescent lights, a smell of disinfectant and lemon that never fully chased away the underlying kettle of ash smell of old paper and old regrets. The staff were polite to a fault, professionally indifferent. Residents glanced at me with the kind of pity that says more about the giver than the receiver. And then there were the others, the ones who kept a cruel ledger of their own. Mrs. Langley with her knitted shawls and sharp tongue, who loved to tell stories, but always with a footnote of, well, she always was a bit simple, poor thing. Mr. Harris, who fancied himself a raconteur and would pat my hand and then laugh about women folk over his biscuits. A woman named Lila, who liked to flick her cigarette ash and roll her eyes when I asked for help with the television. They all did their small violences, the ones that accumulate into a single, monstrous thing. People think revenge requires a dramatic turning point, a knife flash of betrayal or a headline moment that changes everything. That happens in novels, and sometimes in life, but more often revenge is an arithmetic of small hurts. A meal pushed off a table, a name misremembered on purpose, a phone call ignored, a story retold with the cruelest embellishments. The day the ledger tipped, it wasn't anything spectacular. It was a bowl of soup, lukewarm and thin, shoved by a woman who liked to make a show of her clumsiness. "Oops," she said, as if the spill weren't intended, but her face made a small, satisfied smile that said otherwise. The soup slid into my lap. People laughed. One of the nurses looked away. My face flushed hot with something that felt like shame and thunder at once. And in that hot, impossible pulse of embarrassment, something inside me quieted into a decision. No more apologies. No more waiting for pity that never came. No more being the houseplant in someone else's living room, a thing to be dusted and admired briefly before being left to yellow. What would you have done in my shoes? I asked myself that question the way soldiers check their kit. Would you have screamed? Would you have called someone? Would you have forgiven? I tried to imagine a younger me. She would have stood up, maybe stormed out, called my children, demanded something. But this body, the one with the slight stoop and the silver at the temples, is not the same as my earlier frame. I had fewer options in the obvious sense, but I had one thing I've always cherished: patience. I started to observe, like a detective watches a crime scene after everyone leaves. I watched timing. The aides who were always 2 cups of coffee behind. The volunteer who liked to walk the same corridor at 3:10. The television schedule. Who ate early and who ate late. I watched alliances form and fray, and I listened. Oh, how I listened. Secrets flew in corridors disguised as gossip. People let them loose like birds because words flew faster than consequences here. My plan did not begin with grand schemes or explosive retribution. It began with small truths. I collected little things that would make a narrative: photos, overheard confessions, slips of paper. I learned that Mrs. Langley's son paid her care bill only sparingly, and that she had been stealing small amounts of money from her roommate's drawer for years. I learned that Mr. Harris's harmless jokes covered a temper that once smashed a television when a nurse refused him a cigarette. Lila had a secret call she took in private that often left her flushed and crooked with guilt. At night, I'd sit in my chair in the dim corner of the common room and feel the hum of the heating pipes and knit nothing at all, while the threads of other people's lives dangled like clues. I began to map leverage points, things that could make people shift when pressure applied in the right place. Revenge, I discovered, is largely about leverage. It is about finding what the other person values: pride, routine, reputation, and gently, surgically removing it. There was a degree of artistry in this slow work, and it suited me. I could be patient because I had waited my whole life for people to notice me. What I did not have was cruelty in the sense of physical harm. I wanted to ruin them in the way they had ruined me, publicly, socially, in the only currencies they still respected: dignity and agency. It felt righteous because the old age home had become a theater where petty tyrants rehearsed their small cruelties every day. I would not poison. I would not lash out with fists. I would dismantle the image they had built at my expense and hand them the mirror. The first phase of my plan was exposure. I began to create situations in which these small cruelties became obvious to everyone, including the staff. I started with the easiest, the kindest, littlest overlooked. When Mrs. Langley's roommate, a gentlewoman named Esther, misplaced a small locket, I found it and made a point of giving it back with a flourish. I let the room know that the necklace had been missing and watched as suspicion drifted like smoke toward Mrs. Langley. Then I casually mentioned, within earshot of a staff member, that Mrs. Langley seemed very interested in keeping her roommate's charity catalogs in her drawer. Not that it's important, I said with a smile, but people should be careful with other people's things. It was harmless, a murmur, but it planted a seed. The second phase was documentation. I knew that accusations in places like this dissolve if they exist only as feelings. They needed proof. I started to collect small receipts, to note times, to memorize phrases, to have allies without them being aware of what they'd be asking. I befriended a young volunteer, Clara, who liked to sit with me and paint the afternoons away. She was 22 and truly believed that the world had been kinder before she'd seen the reality. She told me stories about her mother, who'd left for another life, and how she'd come to the old age home for a summer job. She trusted easily. I fed that trust carefully, letting her notice the patterns I wanted her to notice, and she took notes without ever realizing the full import of what she'd recorded. Young people are useful in conspiracies sometimes because they take things at face value, and their innocence is a veil under which you can move.
Close calls were inevitable. Twice, on 2 separate mornings, a nurse came into the day room and said, "We've had complaints about someone taking things from rooms," and I felt my chest drop as if the house itself were shaking. My mind raced. Had my hints been too obvious? Had I been reckless? In those moments, I played a dangerous game, the game of appearing cooperative while steering suspicion toward its true target. "Oh my, that's dreadful," I said aloud once, and the nurse, who was young and exhausted, nodded and moved on. Twice, friends I had forged, other residents, backed me up in small ways, saying they had noticed things. They had heard laughter that sounded triumphal when someone was hurt. That sense of community, unexpected and delicate, became the mortar of my plan. I was not alone in my indignation, though I had felt alone for a long time. As my exposures accumulated, the social structure of the home began to creak. People who had enjoyed little dominions of cruelty found their footstools kicked away. Mrs. Langley, who'd never faced a question about her little thefts, suddenly felt eyes settling on her. She reacted the way tyrants do, by denying so loudly that the denial itself became suspicious. Mr. Harris, confronted by someone who remembered the sound of his temper, became defensive and volatile, puffing up like an insulted rooster. Leela, whose secret calls I had managed to overhear, started to avoid the common room at certain hours, her cigarette smoke trailing like an accusation. "What would you have done in my shoes?" I ask again, sometimes aloud, to the empty air, as if the question could crystallize the moral logic of what I was doing. You may think of me as cold, but my actions were threaded with grief. Revenge wore the face of justice. It was the only language that had ever roused anyone's attention. I wanted them to feel, even briefly, the small humiliation they had inflicted on me 1,000 times. I wanted them to understand urgency. I wanted my ledger to be visible. When the staff finally began an investigation, it was small at first, a paper trail, a few closed-door conversations. I kept my posture unimpeachable, mild, cooperative, grateful for their attention. They came and asked questions, and I listened carefully to the words they used and the assumptions they carried. They treated the whole affair like a housekeeping problem, rather than as an ethical crisis, which suited me. Bureaucracies are slow and clumsy, but they also create records, and records are a weapon if you know how to use them. I nudged conversations toward facts, toward receipts, toward specific times. I mentioned casually that I had noticed a pair of glasses that had turned up in Mrs. Langley's bedside drawer and watched the nurse's pen scratch on a clipboard. I let the staff do the heavy lifting of appearing to be in charge while I orchestrated the narrative. Still, revenge is not a straight line. Obstacles rose like reefs just beneath the calm sea. My body rebelled. Arthritis flared up on a cold night and left me in pain for days. My memory, always reliable, had hiccups when I was exhausted. There were residents who came to Mrs. Langley's defense because they had been beneficiaries of her manipulations and didn't want that to be visible. A particularly venomous woman named Norma, who had always delighted in gossip, tried to paint me as paranoid, an old woman imagining slights. I could feel the whole thing tipping. One misstep, and this would all collapse. The staff might consider me bitter and forget it. More proof that I was harmless. But I had learned to build redundancy into my plan. For every whispered accusation, I had a corroborator. For every missing item, a receipt. For every insult, a witness who had heard it. It was tedious, dull work, but it was precise, surgical even. Then came the evening when everything began to accelerate. It was a Sunday, and the home was quieter than usual. The television played soft jazz. The afternoon sun slanted across the linoleum. I had arranged carefully for a small tea to take place in the lounge, a social hour that the staff advertised as an opportunity for families to meet residents, except that few families ever came. I made a point of sitting in the middle, knitting quietly, as I always did. I had invited, in a roundabout way, an inspector from the oversight agency. This would be the delicate tease of my plan. I didn't directly invite him. He was doing a routine check, and his arrival was public knowledge through the bulletin board. But I had carefully placed certain conversations where they would be overheard. Clara, the volunteer, had been coached, unknowingly, to ask loud, casual questions about residents' belongings and to be seen making notes. A nurse would be asked about past complaints in a hallway. Small exposures placed like dominoes. I watched as the dominoes fell. The inspector noticed the discrepancies. He asked about Mr. Harris's temper, and the nurse, flustered, admitted that there had been issues. He asked gently about missing personal items, and the conversation drifted toward Mrs. Langley. "We've had concerns about certain behaviors," the inspector said, eyes narrowing, and the air that had always been heavy in the room seemed to breathe in. People began to look at Mrs. Langley the way one looks at someone suspected of theft, curiously, with a little vindication. Mrs. Langley's eyes became hard. She began to sputter denials that no one found convincing. The social gravity of the home shifted. Those who had been docile now felt suddenly the equilibrium tilt. Once suspicion turned into procedure, things moved fast. Paperwork, calls to family members, a formal inquiry, staff interviews where I kept my cool and told the truth in small, measured doses. I watched as some of my tormentors standing crumbled. Those who had relied on the silent approval of their peers for the right to be petty found themselves alone in their small misdeeds. But there is always a cost to upheaval. The old age home does not like storms. It is designed for routine and predictability. My revelations caused strain, the kind that ripples into innocent corners. People who had nothing to do with the manipulations found themselves questioned, their lives briefly parsed by bureaucrats. I did not enjoy that. I felt a quiet first stir of regret for the collateral discomfort, but the ledger had to be balanced. There is no justice without a reckoning, and I had been balancing debts for longer than most of those present had been alive. The climax, when it finally arrived, was not the blaze of theatrical revenge I once imagined. It was quieter, crueler in its simplicity. Mr. Harris, already fragile from the scrutiny, became reckless. He confronted me in the hallway one morning, his voice a mixture of indignation and fear. "You think you've done something, don't you? You and your young friends." He thought he was intimidating me. He thought the old could be cowed by a raised voice. I looked at him steadily, the way a surgeon looks at a patient who must be woken. "You've been cruel. You made jokes about what you thought were weaknesses. You think you're justified because you've suffered yourself, but you hurt people. You built pleasure on their humiliation." His face, red and puffed, faltered in the face of simple truth. Other residents gathered, curious.
Then the paperwork emerged. An audit revealed small withdrawals, petty pilfering, lies about availability of funds. Mr. Harris's son was called in. He arrived angry and dense with disbelief at first, but as evidence stacked, a series of recorded nurse observations, receipts, Clara's notes, his disbelief turned to shame. The home recommended mediation and restitution. Mrs. Langley, confronted with the evidence of her taking from a roommate, broke into a rage that left her isolated. Lila's secret, an elderly man she'd been siphoning sympathy from, is exposed in a phone log that looked like carelessness but was not. The social architecture that had protected these small tyrants collapsed, one careful piece at a time. You may wonder if I felt triumphant in that moment where the last card fell. Yes, I felt triumph, but it was bittersweet. There was this odd, quiet emptiness that followed the moment of victory, the same way a well-timed joke leaves a hollow after the laughter. I had wanted them to feel small so that I could be large again, not just in my own view, but as a person who deserved dignity. They felt small. The faces were drained of color and that thin fluorescent light. Some of them cried, some of them tried to bargain. Mr. Harris apologized, but apologies in that space were like bandages, temporary and insufficient. Mrs. Langley curled into herself and spoke less.
I had won, and I was suddenly, startlingly alone. After the confrontation and the formalities, after the inspectors left with their clipboards, and the staff reorganized their schedules and the way people do to maintain order, I sat in the lounge and felt the echo of everything like a ringing bell. People came to me, some with awkward attempts at friendship, others with nervous smiles as if the world had rearranged and they didn't know what to say. Clara slipped into the chair beside me and took my hand. "You did good," she said, and I wanted to tell her what it cost me to be the instrument of this upheaval. I wanted to confess that there had been nights I lay awake, fingers pricked by the guilt of shaking a community that had never truly welcomed me. But I didn't, because there are truths you carry like heavy stones, necessary ballast, and you cannot put them down in front of anyone. Reflection came slowly, like dusk. I thought about my children, how they had missed the subtleties of my decline, and how their absence had been the original wound that set all the rest in motion. I thought about dignity and how fragile it is, and how easily people trade it away for convenience. I thought about how power can be quiet and patient, and how underestimated people live with small strategies you cannot see. "Be honest," I said aloud once to an empty room. "Would you have waited this long for payback?" I pictured younger me, proud, hot, unafraid, wondering whether patience had been a coward's trick or a wiser path. In the end, the revenge had not given me the sweet vindication I had imagined. It had given me closure, an accounting of wrongs, and the knowledge that I could still influence the world around me. That was, in its own way, enough. In the weeks that followed, the home settled into a new rhythm. Some staff members were shifted, policies changed to protect residents' property and privacy more carefully. People who had been mean learned to measure their jests. Life went on, which is what anger cannot stop and grief cannot kill. I received a few phone calls from my children after the inquiry, a flurry of concern that felt oddly timed, as if the calamity had jolted their consciences. We spoke, and the conversations were awkward, tentative, the way stitches are tentative until the skin fully heals. I did not pretend to forgive everything immediately. Forgiveness, I have learned, is a different muscle from retaliation. It needs slow rebuilding. Sometimes, late at night, I still replay moments in my head. The way Mrs. Langley's hand shook as she apologized, was that a real repentance or a desperate attempt to salvage community standing? Did Mr. Harris learn anything permanent? Or would he simply find a new set of victims? I don't know. People rarely change entirely because of one humiliation. But systems can be nudged, and that is what I had done, nudged a system that allowed casual cruelty into better accountability. It was not vengeance in the violent, cinematic sense. It was a reclamation, small, deliberate, legal, and devastating enough to be felt. What I did taught me one more thing, that the real power of revenge is not the act of making someone suffer, but the reclamation of one's voice. I never wanted them to suffer beyond the discomfort of their conscience and the consequences of being exposed. I wanted to be seen. I wanted the ledger balanced. I wanted to remind the world that old people are not invisible currency. After the dust settled, I took small pleasures. I sat by the sunlit window and read again slowly, taking time with sentences. I wore a bright scarf that I had not dared to wear before and felt like a loud color in a muted painting. I started a small writing group with Clara and a few others where we shared stories about things we had done in youth that were foolish and brave and all the in-betweens. I recognized that revenge had been one way to make noise. Creativity was another, kinder way. If you ask me now whether I would do it again, the answer is complicated. Part of me,
honest and stubborn, would say yes, because being invisible hurts and the ledger needed balancing. But another part, softer and more surprised by its own tenderness, would say that there are other ways to be seen, by cultivating small joys, by gathering allies, by telling our stories before they are retold as jokes by others. Still, there are nights when the old wound flashes, and I remember the way they laughed at my spilled soup, and I feel a cold satisfaction that they will remember me differently now. I am no longer the harmless old woman in the corner. I'm a woman who kept accounts and made them pay. I am, in a quiet, private way, satisfied. So I leave you with this. If you ever find yourself underestimated, take inventory of what you still have. It might not be youth or speed or influence, but patience, observation, and the ability to tell the truth in controlled ways are powerful tools. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have waited? Would you have struck sooner? Be honest with me, because revenge and justice are complicated bedfellows. They can both heal and hurt. For me, the ledger is closed for now. I sleep more easily. I laugh more openly. And when someone leans over during key and says a petty thing about another resident, I catch their eye and smile in the way a person does when they know a secret. They no longer think I am harmless. They never will again.